cells so that we're not having outside noise, things like that. So, and yep, thank you. Okay. Oh, you know, I forgot to do this. I forgot to make April the co-host. So I'm going to do that for a second here, if you don't mind.
Somebody already took care of it. Looks like I'm already the co-host.
Oh, great. That's Wendy. And Wendy does such a good job.
She's on
So
it.
before we get started, though, I do need to share this with everybody here that the Syracuse Labor Council, AFL-CIO, is committed to providing an environment free from discrimination and harassment. We ask all meeting participants to embrace the values of equity, equality, conduct themselves in this meeting consistent with those values. There is a designated as first point of contact for anyone who thinks they've experienced discrimination, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior. We urge you to contact Lori Nielsen if you have any concerns. Please note that the code of conduct applies to all meetings of the Labor Council, including meetings, calls held via Zoom or other software, as both discussion and chat. So please, if you have if you do or see or feel that someone has said something that's not right, Lori Nielsen, there's her number right there. I'll leave that for a minute. So in case you want to jot down her number. And I thank you all for being here today. Brothers and sisters, today this is our second in our courageous conversations around race and about how we are trying to change ourselves within the labor movement. And I have with me today, I don't know if you can, I'm going to try to do this with my thing. This is my favorite time of year because we have these things, and these are cherries from Washington State. These are my very favorite things to eat. It's my favorite, my wife, I drive her crazy because I love cherry everything. But the fact that we get these big, beautiful, dark red, black cherries here in Syracuse every year makes me happy because it's a healthy snack and it's something that I get to do. But now it's the second favorite thing because I got a new favorite thing from Washington State, and that's going to be our speaker here tonight, April Sims. By the way, as a little trivia, behind her is the portrait of Angela Davis. Many people remember Angela Davis during the early 70s and what have you. But Angela Davis actually taught at Syracuse University about 10 years ago. She was here for a few years on a fellowship, and she actually taught up there. So she was actually in Syracuse for a good amount of time. So there is a tie to all of this. But I've gotten to know April through Elise Bryant. Elise has been the one that's kind of steering us through this process. And I'll say this is that, Elise, she's really, she's my sister. Every time I talk to her, I just feel better. And I really am blessed by having her in my life. But we're really going to be blessed with April because April was a lot like me in some ways, in that she was a staff person who later went into a elected leadership role. So like I was in Wendy's job and now I'm the president of Labor Council. She was the executive director of the Washington State Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and now it's the secretary treasurer. And you know what happens to secretary treasurers? Many times they go on to be the president. So we are very lucky to have her. And one other thing I'd like to share is her story is uniquely a union story, and how the union can really change lives and change trajectories of people. So with all that, I'd like to hand it over to our featured speaker tonight, who I know you're going to love, April Sims.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to the leadership of the CLC for inviting me out to talk a little bit about the race and labor program that we have in Washington State, and sending big love to my sister Elise. It's always a treat to share space with you. Even if we're not in the same room, I'm just happy to be in the same Zoom. So, so good to see you. And thank you all for giving me some time on the agenda to talk a little bit about our work in Washington. I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. Because, I'd be nothing without the crutch of my PowerPoint. The only bad thing about a PowerPoint is I lose half my screen, so I can't see some of you anymore, which always makes me just a little bit sad. But what I want to do first, before I start my presentation, is just ground myself by acknowledging the land that I'm on, and that we are all on Indigenous land. I am joining you from the traditional lands of the first people of Tacoma, the Puyallup tribe, and I honor with deep respect and gratitude their elders past and present for their stewardship of this land and its people. I thank them for the privilege of living and working on their land. Mine is a legacy of stolen people on stolen land. So I raised my voice in the fight for Black liberation and the movement for Black lives. And I would invite you all to take a moment and consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us all into this space, and hope that you will consider uncovering these truths as part of your work moving forward. And I'm more than happy to pop some resources in the chat if you're interested in learning more about the land you're on and how best to acknowledge those traditional landholders. So thank you for allowing me to do that. The first thing I want to do as part of my presentation is just lift up the Constitution of the Washington State Labor Council. Our Constitution, which was written, more than 70 years ago, charges us with combating resolutely the forces that seek to undermine the democratic institutions of our nation and to enslave the human soul, and tells us that we shall strive always to win full respect for the dignity of the human individuals whom our unions serve. And I think there can be no higher calling than that. I think it's beautiful language. And as Secretary Treasurer, my fiduciary responsibilities are constitutional compliance and the budget, which doesn't make me a lot of fun at dinner parties, but we don't do a lot of dinner parties anymore anyway. So it's not very exciting until you consider that the budget is a moral document, and how you spend your money is really how you identify your priorities. And when you consider that our Constitution includes language like this, constitutional compliance gets really exciting when we think about the work that we are called to do as a labor movement, and specifically here in Washington State. But I want to take just a minute to share with you why this language resonates with me, not just professionally, because it's part of my responsibilities, but also personally. My grandparents were sharecroppers in rural Louisiana, which means they, like the generations before them, picked cotton just to survive. And when my grandfather learned that the landowner was shorting some of the families on the crop payout, he got the other farmers all riled up. I like to think of him as a union organizer, because that's what we do, is organize workers against bad bosses. But, as you can imagine, the landowner didn't like that much. And that wasn't really done during that time and in that particular place. So he, sent some men to the house. My apologies, I got my window open and it's because it's warm tonight. He sent some men to the house, and they drug my grandfather out to the whipping post. They were intent on making an example out of him. And he escaped because he fought back. And really, it was just because he had what he always referred to as his Texas Jack, which was the knife he kept tucked inside his right boot. But they knew if they found him, they'd lynch him for sure. So the whole family went into hiding. My grandmother, my grandfather, the 5 kids, and they made their way to northern Louisiana, where my grandmother's family told him that he could stay, but only if he could learn to keep his head down and his mouth shut. And, my grandfather knew he couldn't raise his family with any dignity in the violent and segregated South. And he dreamt of a better life, not just for him, but for his children and his children's children. So he left my grandmother in the safekeeping of her family, and he migrated to Washington in search of social and economic justice. And he came through the Hanford plant in Eastern Washington, where for the first time in his life, he earned a fair day's pay for a hard day's work. But this particular town in Eastern Washington, Pasco, was what they call a sundown town. Some of you might be familiar with the phrase sundown town. It's a town where after the sun goes down, you better not be out and about or outside of your neighborhood, or any number of bad things could happen to you. So while my grandfather had economic dignity, he still wasn't free, right? He still didn't have the dignity that comes from being able to work hard, take care of your family, and hold your head up high when you're walking through your neighborhood. It actually wasn't until they moved to Seattle and he got a job as a Teamster working in a department store that he had both the social justice and the economic justice that he was craving and in need of when he fled the violent South. So the work that we do as a labor movement around social and economic justice is, for me and my family, is intertwined. right? We simply can't divide the two. You can't have dignity and freedom if you are not safe in your neighborhood and if you can't pay your bills and take care of your family. So the work that we do at the Washington State Labor Council holds all of that in all of that tension and balance, and is really designed to create an environment where we can have really candid conversations about the work we need to do to become an actively anti-racist organization, and more importantly, really lift up how race has been used as a tool to divide the working class so the wealthy elite can consolidate their wealth and their power at the top. So I'm going to spend some of my time tonight talking a little bit about our process to build out our race and labor program. And if time allows and you all are still interested, I'd love to share just a quick, small portion of one of our training modules with you tonight. And I can't see you all since I'm screen sharing, but I'm going to assume that I'm okay to keep going here. So I'll talk a little bit about the 2015 resolution that started our work in Washington State. And before I do that, I'll share with you a little bit of information about the demographics and the dynamics here. The State Labor Council represents over 600 locals and affiliates and over 500,000 workers all across the state of Washington. We proudly boast having, being in the top 5 in terms of union density in the nation, where we average somewhere between 19 and 20% union density, so nearly twice the national average. But I know that there is an idea, especially outside of Washington and maybe the Pacific Northwest, that this is this liberal mecca, right? And I just want to, dispel the rumors that the streets here might somehow be paved in progressive gold. Lawmakers are not making it rain good policy for workers, families, and communities. We still have a lot of work to do. And we are probably more purple than we are blue, despite what you might hear outside the area. And the truth is, Washington is probably the most passive aggressive nation in the country, second to Oregon, because we beat them in a really vicious game of rock, paper, scissors. That's my attempt at a joke, but I'll move on. So the truth is this state isn't very diverse, right? And our labor, I appreciate the feedback. Our labor community is even less diverse, right? We are probably not unlike any number of state federated bodies across the nation in terms of what our leadership looks like and the leadership of our central labor councils. So in 2015, so I just want to set the stage here. But in 2015, delegates at our convention passed a resolution calling on then President Jeff Johnson to appoint a special committee to take up President Trumka's call to have a serious and open-ended conversation about what we can do and what we should do as a movement to address racism. This resolution was clear that we needed to address institutional and systemic racism, including our own institutional racism. And it called on us to do some community leader outreach. So to reach out to members of the Black clergy, the Black Lives Matter groups, the NAACP. And, candidly, when we reached out to those groups, they basically told us, y'all got your own work to do your work and then come back and talk to us. So it was clear that we needed to do a lot of rebuilding with community partners as well. But then some of you might remember in 2015, the summer of 2015, Black Lives Matter activists interrupted the Bernie Sanders and Social Security rally that we had here in Washington. It was all over the news. They took over the stage, demanded to be heard. This was at the very beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. You can see the Time magazine reported that, Black Lives Matter activists disrupted Bernie Sanders in a speech. And, this is when the passive aggressive racism in the Pacific Northwest was on full display. And it wasn't just the usual suspects, right? This rally was organized by labor. I mean, it was our labor brothers and sisters and siblings that were the rally marshals, right? That were pushing and pulling these women who had taken over the stage. And what we heard loud and clear is it wasn't that folks didn't agree with the message, they just didn't agree with the tactics, right? Even though disruption has long been a tactic of our movement, right? And we've used it effectively. So it was really clear to us that we had our work cut out, not just in terms of institutionally how we make those changes, but also in terms of educating our leaders, brothers and sisters around why the work of becoming an anti-racist organization. So we convened this special committee made up of leaders, members of our constituency groups, and our early meetings included conversations about, who should be at the table. Is this an internal discussion? Do we extend the conversation to community partners? But we really felt like we needed to do some internal cleaning and some internal work. And we finally landed on the need. The first round of this work was to create a training for unions and affiliates so that we could all have common language and a shared understanding of the definition of racism and how it shows up in our movement. So we created a 7-hour, it's now an 8-hour workshop that we affectionately refer to as Race and Labor, where we go over the manifestations of racism, the history of racism in our country and in our movement. And we're really clear about the racism in our movement because we can't shy away from our history if we want to change the future. We talk about differentials in treatment, which is code for privilege. We talk about implicit bias, how to interrupt oppressive moments, and then spend a good chunk of time really brainstorming how do we change our institutions, specifically around areas like negotiations or collective bargaining agreements, organizing, community partnerships, and union culture. And then in 2017, delegates at our convention passed another resolution we call Race and Labor 2.0, really charging us with doubling down on this work so that we were to train all of our affiliate leaders and staff 100% by the end of 2020. I don't have to tell you that we did not meet that goal. I could blame COVID, but the reality is it's just the work is, it's a lot of work. We have over 600 locals and affiliates, but we've taken a pretty good dent in a number of with a number of affiliates. But that resolution also called on us to certify 30 trainers in this curriculum so that we could really move it to scale. We hosted 2 additional Train the Trainer workshops in 2018, and we held a Race and Labor Summit, bringing together 100 young workers of color to create a toolkit and identify best practices in September of 2018. 2019, and then in 2019, delegates passed Race and Labor 3.0, our most ambitious resolution yet, really calling on us to provide the institutional support the program needed so that we could move it from a training to a real program. We created a racial justice committee. The resolution called on us to gather demographic data of our rank and file members and leaders by the end of 2022, to create a social media campaign, to include land acknowledgements as part of our public speaking, and to come up with a rapid response plan for workplace raids. And so that's where we are now, in the middle of implementing this 2019 resolution. So we just in September of 2020 were able to raise enough money to create a director of racial and gender justice so that we could really take this from a training to a program and from a program to a campaign. Because we believe that in labor, we know how to run and win campaigns, and we have to treat our work becoming an anti-racist organization as a campaign. And we really needed to, double down on the resources to do that. And we were able to use this work as an organizing tool. So we were able to recruit more affiliates to the State Labor Council and get some of our affiliates to increase their financial commitments so that we could actually resource this work. We are working on a survey or an assessment. So again, if we're going to treat this like a campaign, how are we assessing where folks are, or surveying where they are and assessing them so we know when we're moving the dial? We're hosting monthly webinars for rank and file members and for leaders to participate, to provide little modules and some training. We are revamping our Train the Trainer, retooling our toolkit, and next week at our convention are launching our certification program. because we were able to raise money so that we could provide stipends for trainers to actually go out and do this work so that we can meet the rising demand and move the program to scale. Some of the impacts, you know, they, yeah, sure, jump in at any time. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. So y'all should jump in.
When you said raise the money, is it like on top of the per capita dues that a local union would need to pay, or was it from like foundations? I mean, how did you raise that money?
Great question. Yeah, so in some cases, it was one-time contributions on top of the per caps. In other cases, there were affiliates that weren't at 100% per caps that agreed to increase their per caps specifically to help fund the work. And the certification program that we're launching next week, we're able to provide stipends for that because we applied for a foundation grant. Which is, you know, it's really exciting, you know, to think about making this a campaign and what it means to prioritize it. And if anybody else has their hands raised, I can't see everyone, so you'll have to let me know.
I'm monitoring the chat. So,
Okay.
and that's the other thing. If anyone else has any questions or anything like that, please feel free to put in the chat.
Yeah, so I mean, that I think goes to, you know, the top point here around culture change. They say that strategy or culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? So you can strategize until the moon explodes, but if you haven't changed your culture and you're not ready for the changes that you want to make, then they just don't stick. So we are experiencing a real culture change. You know, equity, if you do it right, is integrated into everything. And I have had to work really hard with our new director of racial and gender justice, making sure that she doesn't get stretched too thin, because everybody wants, you know, her to work on their program or, you know, to help them implement. All of our departments want help implementing the equity ideas that they have. So we're really seeing a culture shift. This really positioned us well to have candid conversations last year during the increased awareness of racism in our country, right? And all of the public attention that racism was receiving, especially last year. Our largest county in our state, King County, has reached out. We facilitated training for the negotiation team, both labor and management. So as they were working on equity language in their contract, they had shared understanding. Many of our local unions are moving program internally and are reaching out for additional resources and help. We've been able to share this program and our curriculum with other states and other unions. It's open sourced, so we are happy to share it. We just ask that if you improve it or make changes, you let us know, because we are constantly learning. Ask that you credit, you know, our council for the curriculum, but happy to share it at any time. We've gotten a lot more support for our citizenship and naturalization program, really been able to build up capacity for that program.
We like free. Free is very good.
Yes, yeah, all free. There's too much work for us to do, for us not to be sharing the resources to get it done. So I'm happy to share whatever you find most helpful. One of the other impacts, up until the elections, our officer elections in 2018, we have a 35-person executive board. And the only people of color on our 35-person executive board were members of our constituency group. And now a third of our executive board is Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I think that that is a direct impact of the work that we have been doing around becoming an actively anti-racist organization. The other thing is around staffing. When I was hired by the State Labor Council in 2015, I remember quite clearly one of our executive board members coming in and making sure that I knew that the president hired me because he knew he had to hire someone Black in this position. 6 years later, the 5 director positions that we filled since Larry and I were elected officers have all been women under the age of 40, and 4 of them have been women of color. So we are seeing a culture change, not just in representation on our executive board, but also representation at the staff level of our organization, which is really exciting. Challenges. So I don't want to tell you all this good stuff as if it's been easy, because it has not been easy. You know, one of the biggest challenges is how do you prioritize the equity work, especially, you know, in a post-Janus environment. especially, you know, in a COVID environment. It's really, you know, making sure that we are not only reminding folks of the charge of the Washington State Labor Council, but the charge of our movement, right? Which is to build power for workers. And we can't build power for workers without solidarity. And racism has time and time again been used as a tool to break our solidarity. So we, you know, but it's not always easy. You know, we deal with some color blindness or some white fragility. I'm just going to put that out there, because in a learning space, we have to be candid. We have some leaders who are fearful of, you know, losing power, or what does it mean if we embrace a new style of leadership? So we have to be aware of that. It's always in the room. I think there are not often enough leaders that attend our workshops on equity. We have lots of rank and file, lots of staff, but really getting this on the radar of some of our principal officers and leaders hasn't been easy. That's changing though, but these are definitely some challenges. And the other challenge is, you know, sometimes folks just aren't willing to be uncomfortable. And you can't talk about racism without getting a little bit uncomfortable if you want to do it right. So, you know, this isn't been, it's not always easy. There are definitely challenges, but we are working it through. What we've learned / what we are learning, because the learning is ongoing. The first is that leadership matters, right? If it weren't for Jeff Johnson and Lynn Dotson, who are the former executive officers of the State Labor Council prioritizing this work, we would not be where we are today. Without their leadership and without the continued leadership and investment of Larry Brown, who was the president of the State Labor Council. But we have also learned that there's a difference between brave spaces and safe spaces. We like to talk a lot as facilitators about this as a safe space, but I think we have to recognize that for some of us, there are no brave spaces and there are always power dynamics in the room. And that's, you know, really important to call out as, you know, as we are learning this. We've also learned that there are lots of lessons in the failures. So we're trying to give ourselves space to be creative and bold and know that we're not going to get it perfect every single time, but really making sure that we're capturing those lessons, learning from them so that we can continue to improve the program. I'll lift up lastly that there is no silver bullet or quick fix, right? They say anti-racism work is like brushing your teeth. You got to do it every day, twice a day if you want to impress your hygienist, right? So it requires intentionality. You have to intentionally create space, put time on the agenda, resource it. What I found when I was elected, I was driving this program or holding the program when I was on staff at the State Labor Council. And once I got elected, I had all of the passion and none of the capacity. So we really had to resource the work and bring someone else in who could hold it. And assume responsibility for it. But again, it's no quick fix. Our work is ongoing and we are still learning every day. That's a little bit about our program. I want to do a quick time check because I swear I think I don't need that much time and then I run out. Is there enough time? Do you want to ask questions about this? Would you like me to move into a quick walkthrough of a small piece of our workshop? What's your pleasure?
So let's stop and ask questions if anyone has any questions. If not, then we'll go into the workshop. So does anyone have any questions on? And I think that your talk has been very much what we need. Like just that nuts and boltsy, how did you start this process? And I think all of us here could be proud of the fact that we have taken a lot of these first steps without, you know, and I think, you know, a lot of it's been Lisa's guidance with us, which I have to thank her for. But I think it's just all of us taking ownership of this together. So let me just open up. Anyone have any questions? No. Okay. So not hearing anyone having any questions or things like that. Why don't you go on for the workshop?
Mark, I had a quick question I wanted to ask. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
sure,
I
Elise.
didn't have
Go
my
ahead.
hand up fast enough.
I'm sorry. I have the same problem. I can only see a few people.
Right. So you mentioned cultural change, and that unless you change the culture, then real change won't occur. Can you give an example? You talked about the board membership and the staffing, but can you give us another example of that kind of cultural change that cultural change that brings about change that actually
Mm,
happens.
yeah, I'm trying to think of some specific examples, and I think, and maybe we could stop recording if that's okay with you.